everybody for listening to the banters of a crazy man. Thank you, Keith, for your introductions. I'll try to keep mine relatively brief. So I'm not going to say what companies I work for now, something to do with hammers. I did cross paths with him at a large bank that looks like Sauron down the street.
Hold the mic closer to your mouth.
I got to hold it closer.
There
all right.
Go. You got it.
Get really personal. So I am a manager right now. Underneath what kind of I have vulnerability scanning, pen testing, war games, and what is some people call like red teaming, but more of the red versus blue. Can you see me? I just pwned your box. Did the blue team actually do things? Some people call that purple. I will hold off on any of those comments. Before I get into that, for those who've been around the military, to kind of explain how I got into this role, I was a corpsman and FMF corpsman, so what that means is I was a medical person for the Navy. I served many years with the Marines, the line units as well, and in part of that, I spent many years triaging large things, so large chaoses of mass bodies, figuring out how to figure out which one is priority. Take that to what we do now. We're looking at a mass bout of casualties. Which one's priority, right? That's what Red Team really does. In addition, I also served in the National Guard and had a nice little time in Iraq. With that, I come with the idea of also the OPFOR red teaming approach, where truly the idea of the red teaming goes in there, and we'll hit that in the highlight, but I have certain stances on particularly the colors and really the effectiveness. Bringing that to the short start, went to Bank of America. Before that, I've also worked SCADA systems, emergency operations for Jacksonville, North Carolina, where Camp Lejeune is for 6 years. I've seen pretty much everything from the fire departments, from power systems to SWIFT to ATMs to wireless to all kinds of craziness. And we all need red teaming, or offensive security is probably a better word for it. And I'll stop my rant because I think I'm losing myself in here.
No, you're fine.
It's early in the morning.
It's not and rigid, man. So the first question, and both of you already touched on it, is what is red teaming? There's a lot of debate about what that is. There's a lot of confusion about what that is. Some people think penetration testing is red teaming. Some people think vulnerability scanning is red teaming. Some people claim that they're doing red teaming and they may not be doing it. So from people who are actually managing red teams, can you, now first of all, let me say this, GDS, they do it from an external perspective. They're doing it where companies are hired, they're hiring GDS to come in and do it. They don't have to deal with the political aftermath of whatever's left from the time you deliver the report, whereas Matthew Becker's managing a team from an internal perspective, and they're different, it's different management strategies, I guess, but there's a lot of overlap as well. So from your perspective, Keith, what is red teaming?
So it's whatever the client wants it to be. Ideally, it is a no holds barred, no rules, so interdisciplinary. So whereas a typical pen test, very siloed, is we're going to come in loud with our scanners. In fact, the client has probably whitelisted our IP addresses so that we don't set off alerts. And we try to get as much breadth as possible. In a true red team assessment, we're going to cross all those silos. We're going to leverage the network, the application, the social engineering, the on-site access, and we're going to decide where we take it and not let them know. And so where the siloed pen tests tend to be loud and noisy and you know we're coming, you don't get a true perspective on your ability to detect those activities and you know gauge how well your team can detect them, and then if they can, how are they going to respond to them? So the true pen test, I think, touches on that aspect that is not it's often sort of glossed over.
One of the aspects that defines a penetration test as a penetration test usually is that it's time limited. Do you typically have time constraints on a red team effort?
Since we're being hired and coming externally, the time constraint is usually driven by the budget constraint.
By the budget,
yeah. Yeah. Now, if it's required, if it's part of like a CBEST certification, there's a defined scope that it has to be what it has to be. But if the client is engaging us just to voluntarily, then then they can define the time by the budget. Right. And in some cases, the no holds barred thing is flexible as well. You know, they may say, we're just interested in technology, so you can look at our applications, our network, et cetera, but social engineering is off the table.
Okay. Matthew, what's red teaming from your perspective?
So red teaming, in my perspective, will pull away all the cool metal and magic pieces. Basically, it's trying to understand really a full perspective of all the amount of money you put into everything and how secure your business is. I really look at it as, if you go back to the history in itself, red comes from the red versus blue, kind of more of the Cold War type of approach, where militaries would act as the opposing force, using their tools, tactics, and techniques, the people, the way they worked, the equipment they used, and trying to see how they could defend and actually interact. And there was also the white team. We're doing the same thing really around business. I think one of the shifts is we spend a lot of time on information security, but really what we're doing is we're testing to see in IT itself has pretty much become like the lifeblood of everything we have. Our business runs completely on everything. Everything from our water, from the power lines. We're seeing all that in headline news. That stuff's been going on for 20 years plus. But we're driving with the idea, and businesses are saying, it's great, let's get rid of people. We don't have to handle them. We've got these machines. They're forgetting that these machines are actually what's running their business. It's what's making their money. It's what's keeping them there. It's also making sure they're getting paid every day. So to me, that's what red team truly is. As we get into the intermix of the colors and those pieces, I think that pen testing does actually has a facet of it, but it's just like organized crime. They're using computers now just like a gun. It's just a tool to get to a means to finish something. If you want to take it into the criminal element, they're just using it to do a crime. There's an end goal. There's a human part. And also, this is one thing I think should be put into red teaming when we are talking about it, and even some of the pen testing, the behaviors of how they're acting. This is also going back to the purple color. We're looking to see how someone actually did something and compromised it, how the script looked on an Nmap or whatever technical piece you're actually looking at, and seeing what that reaction is. So it's the full gamut of looking at people, process, technology, and more of like a business security, or how am I doing after all the money I've spent. One last thing, if you don't have the vuln scans and the pen tests and all the light stuff done before then, don't even buy or bring in a red team. It's going to be too easy. They're going to make it one way or another anyway, if that's what they're brought for. They're looking for no holds bars. They're looking for social engineering. They're looking for going after badges. They're looking for technology, signal waves, psyops. You could bring all kinds of cool things, and that's psychological ops. That's propaganda, that type of stuff. You can have all that in there, but if you don't have some of the basics, you're just wasting money.
By the way, if any of you have any questions at any point in time, even though we're going to reserve questions, or there will be some time for questions at the end, if you have questions and you're like, hey, I want to ask something, feel free to raise your hand and jump in. It's
I got
totally
one
okay.
thing.
Yeah. And
please, don't take this as anything of being wrong or the way it's approached. Really, the whole thing is just explaining it to other people who are not in this, who are understanding the pink and the reds and the hacker. You walk into a room and you say, I've worked 6 months on this great project, and it's going to be all the money I've spent and my merits, and these are all the metrics I'm supposed to have this running with the 5 nines of keeping it uptime, and you've walked in there and said, oh, shit, you didn't do a lot of stuff. There's a hole there, and I just shut it all off. Kind of pisses people off. So the goal is really trying to help people instead of getting it all scary. There's a boogeyman.
Yeah. No, you're fine. I was just thinking, I've heard you use the term business security before, because it's not just about information security anymore. I'm hoping you'll elaborate on that some in a little bit. So I'm kind of curious, show of hands, who is in offensive security today, right now? Who's employed, making their living doing that? Okay. And go ahead and put those down. And who is interested in being in offensive security at some point in time? Excellent. Okay, so that makes sense. Is there anybody in this room that's not interested in being in offensive security? Not interested? If you've been in it a while, yeah, at some point you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. Yeah, but I don't know what else I'm going to do, right? So, yeah. We've got the cave picked out. We're going totally off grid. Right. So, where was I going with that?
Primitive skills. We're out there with fire now.
Yeah, so business. It's something. So I used to work under Matthew up until very recently, and he used the term business security whenever he's making the case to management of why red teaming is an important activity. because not all businesses have an appetite for red teaming. They might say they do, but when it comes down to it, they're like, oh, yeah, we do, but you can't touch the production systems. Well, okay, well, that's not red teaming. Okay, well, yeah, you can touch production systems, but don't take them offline. Well, I can't make that guarantee. It may go offline. I mean, there's no guarantee that I can't do that. So at the end of the day, you either have, it might be a penetration test or it might actually be a vulnerability scan. But business security encompasses more than just the IT, and Matthew was alluding to this, and I don't want to steal anything that he's about to say, but it gets into the physical security aspects. It gets into the people, which is quite honestly still the weakest link in any organization, the human element. And it's unfortunate, but I don't think we're ever going to replace humans entirely unless we go full-on matrix style and plug people in, and we're just using them as an energy source to power the computers. You laugh, but hey, man, it's not that far of a stretch. How would you know if you weren't there already right now? You might actually be plugged in today.
Yeah, now we're getting into what is human and what's soul. That's a whole other conversation.
Totally different panel discussion. Right. So I'm going to...
We got a question?
Question, yeah. Sure. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. I'm sorry. I started thinking about it, but yeah. He's asking, is there a common... like, is there a path to win every single time?
So I'm going to take a step back. There isn't an exact exploit that I would say is a technological piece. I think as a whole, and every CISSP, and I've been also on this, have talked about it. We talk about Sun Tzu. Everybody familiar with Sun Tzu, Art of War. Someone will say, know thyself, right? Sounds easy, right? No one has system of records. That right there is the first problem. They don't know what's important for a lot of them. They have a lot of protocols that are unsecure, and it's a business need, and there's a lot of, that's how it was run, so well, just keep running. A lot of businesses have continued to drive with an older model, going back to the putting this technology underneath it, just forgetting that, I don't know, 1970s, we were just turning into color television. It's new. It's a technology. We're running on things. Our forefathers, and these are people, some of these people here have like, wow, this is new technology. If we looked at this years ago, it was like, ooh, someone's going to go shopping online. It wasn't an idea. Now it's every day, and we're pushing societies collectively in that. And going back to basically the security, they're not knowing how to understand what is their heart versus their arm. How do they cut off and stay alive? And that's the biggest problem, is they don't understand the inside and the outside. We're still also arguing about things of the M&M, hard outside, squishy inside. Don't worry about it. The adversaries are just going to go on the outside. Lance actually had the old model of the castle. They still think we're in a castle on a global scale. That's the problem that I see collectively. Is it one exploit? I don't personally have one off the top of my list.
Keith?
Yeah, no, from a technology only perspective, I would say no. There's not really, in the early days of the internet and security, it was common to attack the network perimeter. You had firewalls that failed open, and so everybody focused on patching that, fixing that, and then so the attacks moved up to the application layer. You've got SQL injection, cross-site scripting. They've started to do a better job patching that, and so it keeps moving up the stack. So I would say if there's anything that we find that's common across all of them, it's pushing beyond that technology stack into the layer 8, the humans, the social engineering. And if I were to back into the technology stack a little bit, it would be administrative interfaces that are exposed externally that just have a simple username and password for logging in, which is not a vulnerability in and of itself. It's it's not going to be picked up by your vuln scanner probably, but that's where we can then tie those two together, the social engineering, where we can phish them for credentials and then go back to that administrative login interface that should be locked down with two-factor authentication, or even ideally, behind the firewall where it requires VPN.
So the question was, I just want to make sure that, and make sure the people back there understand what it is, and these guys as well. You've heard a lot of problems with Active Directory, and you want to know if that comes up as a path to success for owning the organization? Well, Active Directory is definitely a target, a very rich target, because everything's managed from there, right? Yes. I was trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. Yeah, so really, yeah, it's a credential question, right? And it boils down to password strength, or I can let one of these guys answer.
Oh, you're doing fine. Keep going.
It's a lot of times you don't even need the password. If you got the hash, you can pass the hash attack. It's an attack where you take the hash and you feed it to another system, and it just, oh, okay, yeah, you're so-and-so, come on in. And once you do that to a domain controller, if you have a domain admin credential, then you've got the entire domain, and once you've got that, you pretty much own the organization, so to speak. You own that system, you own that network, now you own that entire company. And if you're an ethical hacker, then you put it in your report, and if you're an unethical hacker, you do bad and malicious things to them, right? So the teams that these guys are running are ethical hackers. They're trying to let the organization know that these problems exist beforehand. Let's see. I've lost my place. So I'm kind of curious, what pushbacks do you get from management whenever you when you start talking about red team efforts? And Keith, I don't know if do you experience pushback from management? Because I mean, they're coming to you and they're saying, "Hey, we want you to do this," and then you say, "Okay, well, here's our plan." Do you get pushback from them?
Not so much. Once they've engaged us, they've already internally committed to it. I would think the only pushback we might receive is they start off with pie in the sky ideas. We want the full red team experience, no holes barred.
And you tell them the price, and they go, "Well, you got anything a little cheaper."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So.
Quicker, yes.
Faster, cheaper. Yeah.
What about an internal red team perspective? What kind of challenges do you face from maybe the peers that you're working with, in addition to management above? And you can talk broad. You don't have to talk about current experiences.
I'm trying to figure out which approach is the easiest approach. So I get the luxury, unfortunately. You get to, hey, here's your report. Have a nice day. You can call me if you want. I get the luxury of, here's the report. Here's a bunch of extra work that you've already had, and you already had your performances and your eval is already based on how much you're doing to build things into production. Now I've slowed down everything. Or depending on many companies, they have this great idea that we're gonna stop businesses from putting things out in production without any defects. Yeah, you try telling an SVP who thinks that they own the world and that their job is the reason the company runs, that they're not being able to push out their big project they've been boasting about. So that can definitely be a challenge. I will pause there. However, and I'm going to use a word that sounds weird in the red teaming and my own little aluminum hat. NSA IAM, if you haven't dug that up, it's an old book that the NSA put out for information assurance methodology. In essence, basically what it is, it's the best way to try to understand the worst case scenario in your pre-assessment of finding out what that person cares about. Ask them, to negate this problem, you need to understand the business. You need to understand their pain points, their problems, their scare. The more you can figure out how to make your exploits correlate to that, the easiest they'll be able to digest that pill. Otherwise, you'll just say, cross-site scripting over there. That's cool. What does that mean? Oh, it's going to take down your business. We also have lots of talks on social engineering. If you can social engineer an SVP to be like, I understand, this is going to take down my business. I can go to jail, that stuff. That helps. Not always. I've also had challenges sometimes of just leadership, and this also goes back to the colors, and I want a pink team versus a red team, trying to explain sometimes to management why you need things like get out of jail free card. Because they think collectively that their enterprise and their instances as the overarching laws and anything within those 4 brick and mortar pieces covers you. It doesn't. I mean, would you feel safe without going without at least some paper saying I'm supposed to be here?
We would never do that. No.
Question.
So that's an interesting point. Could you speak to the overlap between red team activities against any organization, but especially those that are regulated, like let's say a small bank that looks like a power bar over here, and law enforcement. So, I believe that there may be some difference of opinion between law enforcement and those in the red team about the legitimacy of trying to social engineer gain access to the system. So where's the line, and how do you get around that?
And there's one other compounding piece of this thing called CNN and Fox News that just scares everyone, so we're hyper aware. Media side. Well, it does play into it because depending on where the background of the law enforcement, and being with my military background in Marine Corps, some of them, when they turn and transition, they want to be due diligent. It can be a good thing, but sometimes that adds to it. So taking the law back, and I'm going to make sure I try to answer the question, and if I didn't answer it, please ask in a different way. When I'm going back to the get out of jail free card, in our aspect, looking at a bank, you have the idea that you can go into that bank and you can go and play with like their ATMs because it's got their logo on it, right? However, once something goes into it, it becomes monetary money. It becomes United States. Law enforcement takes that as a different approach. Now you're doing money laundering and other pieces. In there, where does that blend into how they're going to incarcerate you? Because they don't understand, and you're now breaking something that's now federal law versus a civilian allowance. Is that where you were going with the question?
That's exactly where I'm going.
So in that is also some of the challenges you have to explain to management, that it isn't the myopic or the very short, I've been arrested and I have a piece of paper. It's what's going to happen afterwards when they start prosecuting you. That you have actually a legal backing, that there's something out of it. In addition, they also have to understand while you're incarcerated, there's no red teaming going on. So that money they spent on you, it's just wasting away.
So hang on. An internal red team, they have a title of a red team. They have a manager to manage the red team. They hire people with the skill sets to do red teaming. They still have to make a case internally for being able to red team the organization?
There are cases of those, yes.
That's so interesting. Okay.
Once you've been doing red teaming long enough, you'd probably I'm going with them.
It seems odd because, you know, and if they're putting forth the job descriptions, they're hiring the talent, they're seeking out, they're doing the interviews, they have the funding, it seems like they've already made the decision to employ the people with that skill set to do those things against the organization so they can identify the weaknesses before the people that aren't on their payroll identify those issues and they end up in the news.
Some of those are, and nothing against any of the instructors and the peers, SANS, they look at the marketing, they say, I need pen testing and red teaming. Get us one. Cool, we got one. PCI, OSCP. We need one. I don't know what this is going to do, but we need one. And they don't understand really how that plays in their business, what exactly it is. Information security is still, some companies are still like having problems of the old antivirus. We put an antivirus in there, now we have resource problems. Maybe you should upgrade that resource instead of saying turn off the antivirus.
Got a question over here.
Kind of touched on it earlier. As far as being limited by scope, during engagements, do you find that the scope is so limited that you're not getting a true good sense of what either a pen test or red team should be able to accomplish compared to what outside actors would be thrown against your organization?
Yes, I'll actually let you.
So
I'll be quiet for once, and then I'll go.
Sure. I mean, yes, that happens sometimes. We we try to point out where those weaknesses are and what they're getting for their money, and then ultimately, they make that decision. So, I'm not sure what else to add to that.
Well, it sounds like it's going back to definition, though. And I had it, and I didn't ask it, but so what is a penetration test? What defines a penetration test as opposed to, say, a product assessment or a vulnerability scan? How do you differentiate a penetration test from a vulnerability scan or a vulnerability assessment?
Right. So we've touched on the no holds barred aspect.
So that's
and the
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and the interdisciplinary nature of it. I think another key difference is instead of going a mile wide and an inch deep, we're going to do reconnaissance. We're going to figure out where we're going to focus, and so we're going to maybe we're not going to look at something over here, but we're going to identify we think this is a promising vector, and then we're going to see how deep we can take it, and we're going to try to do it as quietly as we can, just like an actual attacker would. So you're going to that's the.
So you're talking about red teaming at this point.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did I misunderstand your question?
Well, the question was, what is a penetration test? And so hang on.
Yep.
I got one thing to add here. I've heard it explained this way. The difference between a penetration test and a red team activity would be post-exploitation. What do you do after you've popped the box, so to speak, right? Because at least in my experience, and probably some of the other people sitting in this room, a penetration test is time limited, and you have specific targets, and you're not really generally allowed to touch any targets that are outside of scope. I see a few nods going. So that's more or less a penetration test. A vulnerability assessment would include like a vulnerability scanner, which knows about some common problems and ways to identify them, and it generates a mountain of information. And a vulnerability assessment might include manually going through those and determining if these are valid vulnerabilities or are they false positives within your environment. Do we agree on this so far? Okay. So a red team exercise would be, once you're successfully penetrated a system, what other systems is that system connected to? What things of value are on that system, and how could you use that to further damage the organization? Does that sound about right? Or am I?
No, yeah, I think so. So you're speaking more to once you've gained that foothold, you've proved you can pop the box.
Right. So that would be a successful penetration test.
That's a pen test. So now we're pivoting from that point and seeing how far we can go, and what can we find, what can we get, and then once we get it, so that's your ingress. Yep. Find the data, and then we're looking for a sustained egress.
Yep.
And can we do all of that undetected?
Undetected. So does that make sense? Okay. Matthew, do you have anything to add to that? Because there's a lot of confusion about the definitions, I think, still. And
there's still, you could even, and I saw the question, there's still, you could even with the pen test, there's the application pen test, which is myopically around just the application in itself, and then you're looking at the full scale of how integration of the pen test and what you're talking about could almost be goal-oriented pen testing, because it didn't have the physical and the other pieces, but it's getting at least deeper in the dive. And whatever terms you use, the challenge really is just making sure it's consistent English, or for them to understand it. That's really the crux. You can call it what you need. Whatever's the easiest way to explain it. It's just, if we're not explaining that, we can't explain really the value of it at the end. So what you're hitting on is risk appetite. What is their risk appetite? Which is what I was talking about in the pre-part of trying to figure out their worst case scenario, understanding their businesses, the processes, the technology that run those businesses. Because what you're talking about is is exactly right. And not to negate that resources and making sure those low hanging fruit aren't taken care of, but what we're trying to do for collectively the red teaming, pen testing, end result of impacts is we're really trying to understand what the business is, what are their cares. If it's just doxing a bunch of information out of there, seems to be important because they're droning people for it, whatever. But if they're worried about actually, like, I use this system that happens to push out inventory to cross 15 states, that right there is the stopper. It may not be I've doxed their HR stuff or not. They also have a lot of this liability, especially a lot of the Fortune 50 companies. They have this money that's set aside just for the oh crap happens. So that might not be it. The business driver, shutting down their business, finding out what shuts them down. For a bank, it's not the stock market. What they're worried about is a bank run, no one having money in it. That means they've lost all trust. They spend how much money marketing on it. They spend how much money on getting spotlights for like the NFL spot. How much money does that cost? That's that's the impact. If I'm able to get a Twitter account and cause a mass media and cause a run, and you spent how many millions of dollars on marketing and trying to get those contracts and those slots, you've lost that money and the additional money you're gonna have to do to react to it.
Anything you'd like to add? No? Okay. So yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Oh, that was the NSA IAM. It's still kind of floating around. I think it's started to die off. There's also a spider into, I think they have a red teaming module as well. I haven't taken that one, unfortunately. What was the standard? What was the standard? Depends on the industry. It really depends on each industry, each company will pick their own framework and model that they're kind of adhering to. Not saying that you can't use that as the best practices. Honestly, for red teaming and what I would do is I try to understand all of them, because HIPAA, SOX, Basel, which may seem, if you talk to most bank people, the technology is a very small piece of it, but you're talking about liquidity and credit and having no people there being able to pay the bills. It's kind of bad for them.
I'm not familiar with that standard, so.
Oh, it's
ISO, yeah.
But yeah, I wasn't, yeah.
See a hand back there?
Read it, understand it. It's a good start.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. So I think trying to remember, it was somebody from the NSA or somebody spoke recently and said that everybody thinks that that using 0-day vulns is how they get into networks, and it's not. It's just stealing creds, borrowing, finding creds that are stored insecurely or that you phish or whatever. So yeah, patching your biggest security holes is not going to protect you. And I think the other thing goes back to the interdisciplinary nature of these red team assessments. What we try to do is take 2, 3, 4 of those medium risk rated vulnerabilities that you're probably more likely to risk accept and just ignore, and then chain those together, and that's how we get in.
That is actually key. It's the storytelling. It's these myopic one small pieces that start one thing that pivots to X, Y, and Z. That this one device that says, oh, only 3 people log into it, but it's connected to an upstream or downstream to something that happens to be, I don't know, the omni-channel of everyone's driving because they want to have everyone's customer from wiping your butt to knowing I need toilet paper to tell your refrigerator to order it. I don't know. Whatever scenario case they want to come up with. But, yeah. Hey, why not? We're putting web servers and toasters, so why not?
If the customer can define it, that's the goal. That's the best way to do it, right? If they can't, you try to help them get to some sort of goal. If they still can't, then for me personally, I'm trying to back down, and it's not even a goal-oriented penetration test at that point. It might be we can look and see what is there, and we can report on that, right? Unless they have the appetite to just go full bore and go ham on this stuff, then you go ham and report what you find, right? I don't know. Right. 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 Yep.
Call LifeLock.
And the class action suits are becoming extremely common now. The lawyers are all over that. So, hang on one second. We've got a little bit of time left, and there was one question that I think is probably on some folks' minds. So, skill sets. When you're looking to hire people, what skill sets are you looking at? What are you looking at anything in particular, or just what are you looking for in people that you hire for your team?
So because it's interdisciplinary, it's a red team. We're not looking for somebody that's got a one particular skill set. We're looking for people who are somebody who's good in network, somebody who's good in application, somebody who's good at social engineering, and specific, maybe a Windows guy, a Linux guy. So a variety of skill sets that can work together. I think we're looking for people who have a really deep knowledge of their domain. So because one of the things that we're trying to avoid is detection. You can't hire somebody that just is going to come in and with the default settings and guns blazing. They have to know the limitations of the tool, how to tune it to fly under the radar, low and slow, what tools they can't use at all because they're going to have signatures that set off alarms, that kind of stuff.
Matthew?
So in addition to the technical stuff you highlighted, things I look for particularly is people who understand psychology. Psychology of themselves. What is that carrot that gets them up every day? Being in this field for 20-ish years, everyone asks you how you got here. How do you hack? I want to be information security. I want to do it. I tell them, if you want to keep banging your head on the wall and you're bleeding and you like that, that's your passion. Keep going for it. That's what I'm looking for. Because it is. It's when you're arguing with your bosses about trying to articulate risk and saying this is important, and they're going to push back. You're playing devil's advocate. I also look for people who understand processes, looking for holes in things. Because really what we're doing is we're looking for the technology to stop a process to articulate something for that. So one of the questions I'll ask is, what makes a good information security professional? It's one of the common questions I ask. I'm not looking for, someone that can just tell me that I can do a cross-site scripting and show you a pop-up box. Because the executives don't even know what that pop-up box is, let alone how to turn the computer on still. It's not going to help them. And it goes back to actually the question, and I'll keep this brief, but what is the success of a team or a team? One, you've got the client. So even in an internal team, part of the job is you're peddling and you're just like a consultant. Hey, I'm here to destroy your stuff. Will you let me come to destroy your stuff? It's really what was going on. You have to understand their goals and making sure they get a report. In addition, especially for the inside, you also have the other metrics. How many defects you have found? What's your rotation of operational? Like, you did 18 assessments this week. Do 16 more. Those are the battles you're still fighting because you're still getting equated to everyone else. How many buttons did you push? So we're trying to figure out how to tell that and succeed the story. The one last thing is also making sure, working in what we're doing, diverse skills, diverse thought, especially when you get more than 2 people together so you don't get groupthink, they start getting, they're different individuals. You have to be able to understand them, their skill sets, and how to empower them to grow. And that's a key.
Yeah, and I would, I guess, add. So when part of our interview process at GDS is we throw up spin up a intentionally vulnerable application, give you 24 hours to just do a quick pen test on it, and then another 24 hours to write a report and deliver it to us. And we get on the phone, and you play the part of the consultant, and we play the part of the client. And so one of the things we look for is how you deliver it, how you do the risk ratings, how you explain the finding. And I think this goes to the goal-oriented question as well, and how do we, what do we go after, and how do we present it? So if you can get domain creds, that's great, that's going to impress the technical people, but the business guy that owns the application or runs the business is going to be like, well, what does that mean? So if we can get in and use those domain creds to pull out health records or something sensitive and show that as evidence, then that helps them understand. So when we do these interview pen tests, I look for those type of somebody that can explain the vulnerability in business terms and also risk rates it appropriately. So for example, you touched on just cross-site scripting and showing that you can pop up a box. That's great. So I get reports all the time where somebody rates cross-site scripting as critical, right? Well, it turns out in this particular case, all they could do was reflect it back at themselves, right? So, what's the business risk there? And maybe it's still a valid vulnerability, but maybe you want to bump it down a couple of notches. Maybe it's a medium, and then explain that scenario. Walk me through. How the attacker is actually going to leverage that to get to the business assets, not the technical assets.
Hang on one second. Well, because the question always comes up, certificates, and I know it's a fun discussion, and that's had at almost every conference I've ever been to. But is there any minimum level certificate requirements that either of you have of candidates you're looking for?
There's not for us. We don't have a requirement.
Okay.
It's definitely a bonus. I think the OSCP has a lot of prestige for us at GDS.
Yep. It's a certificate produced by Offensive Security. If you haven't heard of it, you should check it out. The PCI standard now lists it as one of the qualifying markers of somebody who can perform an actual assessment that they consider good. Keith mentioned a company or an organization out of Europe, Crest?
Yeah, CBEST.
CBEST?
Yeah.
And I don't know a whole lot about them, but they do a one-for-one with the Offensive Security OSCP certificate for their entry-level penetration test. So, yeah, it does have quite a bit of prestige right now. and with good reason. It's an incredibly difficult certificate to achieve. I know we have a few in the room here, so if you want to talk to people, there are people here today that can answer questions about it. Go ahead, Matthew.
Oddly enough, other certifications are just IT related actually helps as well. So if you happen to be a CCIE in those type of areas, because if you're talking to another CCIE, you've already built that rapport. You already have that technology. And you have to understand the systems as well. So don't negate any other certification and just think that you need to get a security certification. You need to understand and deep dive into all of it and understand how they interconnect.
So what I've heard so far is experience is probably the #1 thing you guys are looking for. So you're not going to typically hire somebody right out of college to do this line of work unless they've been, unless they're just really, really good at what they do and they've had they've studied it since there was a kid here yesterday, by the way, in Doug's exploit development class, 13 years old. I don't know how well he was doing, but I imagine he did fairly well in the class. I think he probably sat back there and pwned all the old farts, but 13 years old. By the time, if he continues on this path, by the time he's 18, let's say, and he's willing to go, he's looking for a job, there's a pretty good chance he could get on with, pretty, what would be, take most people 10, 15 years worth of work experience to get into, because he started so young, right? And he's doing it at a time whenever it's all just seeping right into his brain. Question back there.
We would be very cautious about hiring anybody that's got black hat experience. We deal with very large financial, technology, healthcare companies that are going to do background checks. We do background checks, and some of our clients do even more rigorous background checks. So that could become an issue.
As a blanket statement, I would say I would agree. A lot of being an inside, you're stuck with the other HR regulations. I do think, though, that also because of the legal system collectively and determining of black hat, it also could be situational basis. It could have been that someone did something that wasn't really hacking, but is equated to hacking, that some lawyer said, I'm a hacker, prosecute, having at least that conversation. It also goes back to the other question about information security and how their demeanor is, how they seem to act themselves, how collectively their ethics portray out of it. Because going back to what he was talking about, that the challenge is if you already have someone known as a black hacker, unless you're Kevin Mitnick, they're going to be scared.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's like I said, we would approach it very cautiously. The challenge may be, even if we believe you're now a white hat, we've still got to, you've got to be marketable to our clients. So we would have to take that on a case-by-case basis. And then I wanted to touch back on your comment previously on not hiring out of college. We actually do hire some people directly out of college. I don't know how many, if that applies to anybody here, but okay, good. But typically those are people who live and breathe it and do it outside of the classroom. They're not just going to show us their class, their grades. We ask questions like, what kind, what network do you run at home? What is your involvement with local campus or organizations? If they've started their own OWASP campus organization, really a high level of dedication that they live and breathe it outside of the classroom.
BSides. You can get involved in BSides.
Yes. That too.
So I'm going to plug a couple of local organizations if you're young and you're in college. Right here in Charlotte, there is an OWASP Charlotte chapter. There's a student OWASP Charlotte chapter at UNCC. Charlotte Hackers Anonymous, otherwise known as CHAHA, is a good group of folks to get involved in. There's several members here today. Gosh, who else? Charlotte ISSA, 2600. I know I'm forgetting a few.
CarolinaCon.
CarolinaCon is a great conference. Happens in Raleigh every year. Been going on for a very long time. I'm sorry? Fuzzers Anonymous? This is new to me. Furries? Oh no.
Worries?
That's something.
That's the aftercon.
Not. Yeah, yeah, no. But there's a lot of opportunity, and it is a great way to demonstrate to increase your skills and to demonstrate to potential employers that you didn't just go to school and got a certificate or a degree. You actually care about this stuff. You live it, you breathe it, you sleep it, you eat it. You're passionate about it, I think, is probably the word that sums it all up.
You wipe the blood off your forehead and keep doing it.
Right, keep banging your head on the wall. Why do I keep doing this? I don't know.
You put in 8 hours and then you go home.
You go home and you put in another 8 hours and then you sleep for 8 hours.
Just for fun.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who does that, by the way? Who just does this stuff nonstop? Hands up. How long have you been doing it? For what age did you start? Just everybody shout it out. 18? Huh? Yeah. So young. A lot of you started young. 10, 18, 8. Anybody younger than 8? No. I was 7 myself when. Anyway. Yeah, I had anyway, it was a Commodore 16. Anyway. Good times. I had no storage. Anything I had to write, I had to rewrite it every time I wanted to run it. Yeah, we can talk about that later. Let's see. Any other questions? Okay. Let's do that one there because I saw his hand first. Black shirt, yeah. So the question was, in case, did everybody hear it? Okay, I'll repeat it. The question was, what is the advantage of using a red team, either an internal red team or an external red team versus a company doing bug bounty programs like BugCrowd or HackerOne or any of the other flavors that are out there today?
So I would take it as controlled chaos. From a business perspective, hiring a red team, you're able to actually have a point of contact and collectively get some scope and understanding of what your concerns are. The BugCrowd project definitely has its value, but it's more of swatting flies, especially from the executive thing, because now it's who finds things rather than I'm trying to control and worry about something that may be my worst case scenario. And that also really depends on how the red team pitches it and the scope of the assessment. That would be my take on it.
I guess I'm still trying to process the question. So are we talking about true red teaming that's being crowdsourced, like the whole interdisciplinary, or? Mm-hmm.
So the company you're speaking about is a company called Synap? Okay, I personally haven't heard of it. I don't know if either of you have.
No, I haven't.
I haven't heard of that service.
Okay, so it's kind of hard to say if we don't know that much about it, but
Yeah.
what I gather so far from what you're saying, it's a crowdsourced type activity where they have vetted penetration testers, assessors, red teamers of various sorts, and I don't have it. So the companies would come to them much like a bug bounty program, I imagine. They say, we're interested in your services, and then how does the work become available, and how do the assessors say, I want to work on that, and how is it awarded? Right. So based on what you've said so far, it actually doesn't sound that different to me. The only difference would be from an internal perspective, sounds like it does a lot similar. It would compete with what GDS is doing in a lot of ways. For an internal red team versus Synap, you don't have to dedicate resources to it on a continual basis. In order to have an internal red team, you've got to have people on salary, on staff. But to Matthew's point, it sounds like you lose a lot of control, right? Like when things go sideways, they have somebody they can go wring the neck of and say, you messed something up, you're in trouble now, right? I don't know how that would work with a company that's crowdsourcing that. They would have to deal with Synap, the company, and I don't know what the...
But on the other side, thinking about it, there would be other value because now you have a collective of a larger audience of different skill sets. So one other challenge is making sure if you have a small group that has been there for so long, one, how do you keep a black box approach, meaning they've been there inside, don't look at anything, don't look at anything, don't look at that IP, oh, now I want you to attack it.
Right.
As well as keeping skill sets growing. While most corporations, they say they give training, but they don't have an unlimited budget, you now have a cross of most people who are digging and having that cross spectrum. So I can see some value in there, but from a large business piece, it's really back to that strangle. Who do I strangle for liability?
Right. Yeah, I don't know how coordination, I guess, would work as well. Like, internally with our team, we've internalized. We know what the skill sets are of the different team and what the tools we have available to us. So from a crowdsource perspective, I guess that would be not so much a concern, but at least a question I would have is because there's a lot of coordination is required. So how do they become aware of what's available to them? Oh, I found this vulnerability here, but I need some help to pop it, or maybe they don't even know to ask the question. So I guess that would be a question for me. But then, yeah, go ahead.
No, I have a question for him. So have you participated in Synap exercises? Oh, SynAC. Okay, okay. I'm kind of curious who's in charge of the assessment. Like, who would be the decision maker ultimately if it's so there's managers here that basically get to make the decisions, and then in both cases they report to a customer of some sort. If you got the crowdsourced, you're logging into a website, you've got instructions or some kind of work order that's coming through, do this, do that. But whenever the tester says, hey, I found this, can I go a little further? I'm kind of curious how the decisions are made on the fly. Okay. Okay. It sounds very similar to me. It would probably be a cost savings advantage for the customer, would be the big driver, I would think, but they
lose
the throat to choke. Were there any other questions? I saw some other hands.
I have one other one on the
Sure.
SynAC piece. So would they hire someone who is more from the college level of that approach? Because it may be a value if they could get into that pool showing their commitments, similar to the same thing as what we do here. The more we show our skills, the more kind of we get those pieces. That might be an avenue of someone trying to get into the industry of red teaming, that approach, rather than trying to do the HR. I have to have 5 or 6 years experience. I can't even get past the filter. Excellent. No, thank you.
We've got a little less than 10 minutes, and I don't want to run over because we have another presentation, but I saw your hand next, so.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting and good question. So I did that myself. My degree was in environmental engineering, so I was out inspecting smokestacks and worked for a state government and ended up inheriting a token ring Novell network. So that's how I jumped into technology. And then when I went to Bank of America, I think a large organization gave me an opportunity to get my foot in the door in technology there, and then have a lot of internal teams to become exposed to and pick and choose and get hired internally, transfer that way. So I went from there to internal audit, technology audit at Bank of America, and so that's how I got in.
I don't have anything really. I mean, I can attest to the transfer from a medic to IT is how I did it. Basically, long story short, I went from being with the Marines, running sick call, handing out medications. The doctor would leave. Went to Lakehurst, New Jersey, and they said, "All you get is a blood pressure cuff," and I was bored. So I had to find something else to do.
I think a big organization that has lots of internal, a variety is one way, and that's the route I took. Also, it goes back to the passion, living and breathing it, doing it on your own in the evening. So even if your current job, it doesn't really give you those opportunities, if you're dedicated enough about it, then you can get in the door that way. We hire network administrators that don't have security background. We hire programmers. In fact, I think that's good. They bring a good perspective.
I think what you're doing now, communicating that you're interested to people who are either doing it or can help you get into it, that's key. I mean, almost anybody that's doing this they had to get started somehow, somewhere, and it usually boils down to knowing somebody, and they interviewed you in some way, shape, or form, and they were like, I like you, I like your skill set, I want you on my team. I see a hand back there. That is a very good question. I'm going to turn that over to Keith.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would look into I would ask for an example of a report, a redacted report, because again it goes back to you want to see that they can understand the risks. We can tailor the risk ratings to your business and to the actual scenario, and we're not going to just run a scanner and take the boilerplate out. So GDS, we try not to get into sales mode here, but we pride ourselves in highly customized reports. And weeding out false positives. So I think a good place to start would be, in addition to just your normal, what is your experience, what is your background, but get an actual example of a report. And we customized our remediation recommendations to your technology. So if you're using ASP, we're not going to have a Java recommendation in there, or just a generic boilerplate recommendation. So
that almost assumes though that the customer is educated enough to be able to make that determination and to assess the different companies' skill sets. Man, that's an incredibly good question. I'm going to turn that back on the audience for a moment, because there are other people doing this work. Anybody willing to take a stab at answering that question? The question was, how does a customer vet the services of all the options of vendors that can do this work? Yeah. Does that answer your question? You offer services such as this, don't you, as a vendor? Yeah. Correct. There's a good bit of education involved, even when the client comes and says, "Hey, I need your services," and then trying to get to the bottom of exactly what they need is a big part of it.
And it goes back to the confidence for that customer is paying the money. If you can't explain your services to them, how good are your services? And nothing against it. It is a hard thing. That's why I have such passion about the color challenge.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's the point. The customer coming to you, they're driven by compliance. You mentioned that earlier. They don't really know what it is they want or need, and so right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big problem and a big question. How do you vet the person's skills, right? Is that what you're saying? So there, um, hmm.
Yeah, I think if you can, another question you might ask is, I'm not sure exactly how you would ask it, but try to gauge how much repeat business and long-term relationship they have, because if they're just running basic scans and saying yes to everything that the client asks for, they're probably not going to be around very long. I mean, there are projects that come to us that we say, no, we're not suited for that, or we steer them in a different direction because we think this is, here's what you think you're asking for, but really what you want is this. And it's not to sell them, it's to steer them in the right direction. And in some cases, they'll ask us to engage a project, and we'll be like, you know what, we can answer that in just an hour. We don't even need to bill you for it. And so that builds that long-term trusted relationship. So if you can gauge, get some referrals and try to gauge long-term relationships, that's another, I think, way.
Try to get somebody that hasn't asked a question yet. Let's go green shirt right here. I'm gonna let Matthew.
So this is
right. Yeah.
The question is, do you want to just keep giving them the same reports over and over again, and do you feel like you're just kind of rinsing and repeating, or do you want to collectively improve? Is really what the crux is. The red teaming is, as itself, going back to business security. Really, we're just testing the rubber meets the road. We're seeing if everything else is done, all the processes, all the training, everything else, back to why they spent all that money. If we're not figuring out some way to learn from it, it is, I mean, yes, it's job security, but some people are still learning how to change their password 20 years ago idea, rinse and repeat. So I definitely see there's value in it. For every single engagement, no, but it's going to be it's a continual learning piece. The balance though is always trying to keep making sure that you don't taint, specifically when you get into red teaming, full goal-oriented pen testing, trying to do reactions, that synergy between the red or your offensive and the defensive gets too much and they're muddling and there's collusion or there's assumptions already made, which makes it challenging. Which goes back to that, having an external red team gives you that whole other view, and normally they'd only come in for a year and then wait 3 years if you're doing a full, because it's going to take a while to do a lot of this remediation if you're really doing a full scale.
You said scripts, though. You're not talking about just screenshots and repeatable steps. You're like
Tools.
yeah, man.
That's
So I mean, if you're employed internally though, and your goal is to secure the organization that you're working for, your responsibility is to help train the detection and response capabilities. That's why you're there. That's why they're paying you. Yeah. So I saw Lance's hand up.
When we're hiring people?
No, when you're a candidate in an RFP,
Ah.
Is it difficult to get customer?
It can be. Usually we try to provide 2 or 3 references, and we have some good relationships with a few where, usually we can find 2 or 3, and we try to find references that are specific to the industry, for the client that's engaging us. So there's some that say no and don't want to be, but it's not hard to find 2 or 3.
All right. Yeah, we're gonna have to. We ran over. I'm gonna stop this now because we've got another presentation to go, and then we're gonna do lunch. Appreciate everybody. Appreciate you guys coming out and sharing your time and your experience and your expertise with the group here. Yes.
Yes, thank you for having us. Thank you.
Take a quick break and get back here as quick as you can because we got some.